After 30 years of stagnation, Taito was looking to revitalize Space Invaders. What started as a foundational pillar of gaming had fallen into a trap of resting on past success and repeating everything that came before. With such a significant anniversary on the horizon, the company began to ask themselves, how can we take this small idea and help it evolve? Space Invaders may have a basic concept, but it was one that plotted a brand new course for video games. After Pong became a worldwide phenomenon in the early to mid-70s, Atari would turn the industry on its head again by simply rotating the paddle and presenting a wall of bricks to chip away at. With Breakout, there was now an objective to complete and an obstacle to overcome. It wasn't the first to do so, but it reached a level of success worldwide that no others had. When Japanese developer Tomohiro Nishikado played the game, he was enamored with the concept but also saw potential for more. In an interview with Ali Barter for media outlet Forbes, Nishikado talked about wanting to create the same feeling of satisfaction as clearing a level in Breakout, but with recognizable objects that actually fought back. When discussing how they landed on adversaries from outer space, he stated, "I tried lots of different designs before settling on aliens. Tanks, warships, fighter planes, and so on, but the animation didn't work very well. Humans actually animated smoothly, but shooting at humans didn't resonate well at the time, so we settled on aliens. Back then, aliens meant the octopus-like aliens of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and after that, the sea creature theme naturally led to the crab and the squid." The game was an overwhelming success, becoming one of the highest-grossing titles of the late 70s. While it was later proven to be a myth, there was even a prevalent rumor that the popularity of the game led to a shortage of 100 yen coins in Japan. That level of success bred an unhealthy amount of complacency, however. Countless knockoffs were made and several sequels were produced over the coming decades, but few moved beyond that basic gameplay loop of a lone spaceship holding the line against waves of methodically advancing enemies. There had been occasional deviations from the franchise's formula, but they were mostly incremental in nature. Multiplayer was incorporated into later titles, with a notable competitive version included in a collection of the original arcade games for the PlayStation. A later reissue of that release through the Simple 1500 line of budget-priced titles also included the Space Invaders 3D rendition of the single-player mode, but outside of a change in perspective, it didn't offer much in the way of new gameplay. Space Invaders 95, Attack of the Lunar Loonies, served as a parody of the original game and various others from the shooter genre, incorporating boss fights, exaggerated character design, and a presentation delightfully out of step with the rest of the franchise. An entry created by American-based developers at Z-Axis released in 1999, retaining the boss fights and featuring a new power-up system based on eliminating enemies of the same color. This version included the original Space Invaders as an unlockable, but it only served to show how little progress the series had really made. Following that title's release, the main franchise stayed quiet for nearly 10 years. Space Invaders had permeated pop culture and became emblematic of all video games, but the titles themselves had become a relic of a bygone era. Stewards of the brand at Taito weren't blind to the fact that the games had been treading water since 1978. Rather than produce new entries, they instead demoted it to periodic appearances and compilations. During promotion of yet another collection, this time celebrating the series' 25th anniversary, producer Hiroshi Aoki began to form an idea of where the property could go next. When speaking with Ali Barter alongside Nishikado, Aoki talked about how seeing the perception of Space Invaders outside his home country helped push him towards reevaluating the series. "I don't think anyone in Taito was really interested in developing a new Space Invaders. I believe this is due to the series not having evolved significantly after the first game and subsequent releases being stuck in a gameplay rut, giving the brand an old-fashioned image and making Japanese players and developers alike tired of it. During this time, I traveled to London to promote Space Invaders' anniversary on PlayStation 2, and the press party was an eye-opener. They'd made the brand look and feel so fashionable. The media too showed a respect for Space Invaders which was totally at odds with the feeling it was outdated which I felt back home. It was seeing this which led to me deciding I wanted to remake Space Invaders myself at some point. So when I was given that chance in 2007, I grabbed it." With the 30th anniversary approaching, leadership at Taito looked to their developers for pitches and greenlit a handful of projects with an eye towards finally revitalizing their flagship franchise. Aoki would act as producer on one such title, eventually known as Space Invaders Extreme. It was meant as a refresh of the original 1978 hit, but with an entirely different feel and presentation. Extreme initially released on the Nintendo DS and PlayStation Portable handheld platforms in June of 2008, with a bombastic look and heavily modified game mechanics. Music was now tied to gameplay, with notes being played when shots were fired, adding layers to the prevalent soundtrack. Power-ups could be earned, and many games would regularly show up to add a dose of variety to each level. Boss fights would then cap things off, providing a decent challenge while dominating huge portions of the screen. When discussing the game with Brandon Sheffield of GameDeveloper.com, Aoki explained that he pulled from what he learned during his time working in Taito's arcade division to give more flavor to the title. How bonuses could be earned by taking down enemies in a certain order was inspired by the mechanics of pinball tables, and the lack of cutscenes or story was meant to keep the player engaged and moving. As wild and colorful as the game became, the characters still looked the same. Aoki explained this was also a conscious choice, recognizing that part of the game's global appeal came down to seeing those iconic enemy designs. After the handheld versions received a warm reception, the game would be ported to Xbox Live Arcade the following May by the team at Backbone Entertainment. Gameplay remained intact, but there were a handful of visual changes that came along with the transition to the big screen. Building off of the PSP version, the developers had to put in a lot more work than they expected to give the game the right look. Senior artist Arvin Batista explained in an interview with website Silicon Era that the characters used in the handheld versions didn't fully match up with the 1978 releases, and Taito actually provided the team the original sprite sheets to shape their own from. Artist Conrad Cito also had to manually parse through and modify art in the game to maintain the sharp look players expected from the retro aesthetic. Game designer Jeff Minter was contracted to provide new background visualizations for this version as well, a fitting inclusion given the title was easily comparable to Minter's seminal work with games like Tempest 2000. Minter, a veteran of the industry with releases dating as far back as 1981, stated in a May 2025 panel discussion at gaming convention Zap Live that his first obsession with a game came from seeing the original Space Invaders at a traveling fair in his youth. Arvin Batista explained in his Silicon Era interview how easy the process of working with Minter on the project was. I remember being nervous working with Jeff. With all the stuff he's done, I didn't know how to work with him. Was he just going to do his thing and we just stand back? But once we got started, he was very accommodating. He appreciated the feedback that we were giving him with each iteration of the visualizers, and we were very happy with the work he'd turn in. He made so much more than we required that we decided to try to fit them all into the game. In addition to the overhauled and expanded art, a 4-player cooperative mode was exclusive to the Xbox 360 release. Playing with others can provide more firepower, but a paltry 3 lives are shared between all participants, and there is no option to continue once they're all gone. The amount of coordination needed to succeed would test even the strongest of relationships, but it's the kind of challenge on par with every other part of the package. Classic difficulty is a fair trade-off for such a fresh experience. Regardless of platform, Extreme succeeded in bringing Space Invaders forward in an unlikely way. But Taito wasn't content with just one radical reinvention. The second project queued up for the franchise's 30th anniversary, titled Space Invaders Get Even, offered the rare chance to play through the game's events from the Invaders' perspective. Released in late 2008 and purpose-built for the Nintendo Wii, players would steer their ships and guide an enemy of crabs and squids to destroy targets. Invaders act as both ammunition and health. Getting hit will deplete their numbers, but rapidly shaking the Wii Remote and Nunchuck will call more into battle. Outside of the intentionally anachronistic look of the aliens, the game bears absolutely no resemblance to the arcade classic. Taito staff such as Hiroshi Aoki once again worked behind the scenes, but the game was mostly built by outside developers Cattle Call Inc. A melodramatic story is briefly told through stiff voiceovers and walls of text, but the game is primarily about action and eccentric missions, with invaders abducting cows and slowly dominating the Earth. Even with the game's overall quality, contemporary reviews instead heavily focused on Taito's odd release strategy. On the WiiWare digital marketplace, Get Even had what appeared to be a budget price, but the base game only amounted to about 15 to 30 minutes of actual play. 3 additional mission packs were also put up for sale, and the bulk of the title laid within that downloadable content, leaving consumers to spend 4 times what they'd expected. It was still praised for enjoyable gameplay and inventive use of the Space Invaders property, but that was somewhat overshadowed by the controversy. The game has a tenuous legacy as well due to a lack of re-releases. In an interview with Kai Tatsumoto of website WCCFtech.com, game director at Taito Yuichi Toyama explained that the specialized nature of Get Even made it difficult to put on other platforms. Having been built from the ground up with the Wiimote's gyroscope and pointer as integral parts of gameplay, Taito was unsure of how to adapt the controls. Several collections have been put together since its release, but Get Even has missed all of them. The WiiWare exclusive wouldn't be the only game to lose its place in the series' lineage, though. After a pitch from Ryosuke Ishida, Space Invaders Infinity Gene was initially greenlit to be a part of the 30th anniversary slate of titles. It would eventually release much later, coming to iOS platforms in July of 2009 and home consoles in September of 2010. It also missed out on inclusion in several compilations and, following its delisting from iOS, was left stuck on 7th generation hardware. Despite a mobile-first focus, Ishida started the project with lofty ambitions. When discussing the game with Jonathan Glover of GameDeveloper.com, he explained his desire to not only explore the roots of Space Invaders, but all the shooters that were created in its wake. I wanted to introduce Space Invaders to these younger gamers, and decided a good way to go about it would be to create a single game that traced the entire evolution of the shooter genre, from the original Space Invaders up to the latest advancements in the genre. As Space Invaders Infinity Gene evolves through play, a number of the original arcade game's notable characteristics and limitations are overturned. I was fully aware that some longtime fans might be skeptical of the changes, but I went through with them anyway. The game starts with a look at the traditional Space Invaders gameplay before quickly introducing the concept of evolving. As players complete stages, a meter fills up and unlocks new features for the next level. Each one represents a change the game's inspired by Space Invaders incorporated over time, from free movement to larger enemies, changing weapons, and occasional power-ups. As it deviates from the basic format, series iconography remains present to keep the experience grounded in the franchise. As a result, it gives a clearer view of the original title's place in the history of gaming. Visual design was also meant to evolve, starting monochromatic but adding color, depth, and scrolling as players work through the game. Music once again plays a key role, this time in moving the story along. Ishida explained to Spanner Spencer in an interview for PocketGamer.biz the process of creating the music and the fine line he and the sound designer had to walk. Communicating exactly what kind of music I wanted to the sound designer was where things got tricky, however. Infinity Gene isn't about protecting Earth from invaders, the game is the story. So don't make the melodies very emotional, but don't make them too emotionless either. When asked by Spencer if series creator Tomohiro Nishikado had played Infinity Gene, Ishida was uncertain. In his interview with Forbes, however, Nishikado was quick to praise the inventive title, stating, "Although there were several variants released after Space Invaders 3D, and even competitive versions, I didn't think any of them represented a real evolution until Infinity Gene." As the 30th anniversary came to a close, Taito once again wound down the series. Extreme would see a Nintendo DS exclusive sequel release, and there were various other oddities over the ensuing years, but largely the franchise went back to compilations and collections of early titles. A future anniversary might bring another batch of developers to again deliver something unique, but for now it seems to be enough to serve as inspiration for others to spin off and evolve. In the long run, not every series needs to continue forever. As Infinity Gene tried to show, Space Invaders will always hold its place in history, and someone that grew up playing it will eventually have an idea of how to take the concept even further. In several interviews, including one from the book Game Maestro, published in the year 2000, Nishikado himself expressed the desire for designers to research the history of gaming, but not to simply repeat what had already been done. He hoped that understanding the core concepts of what made foundational games worth playing would help them build something new. Gaming isn't just about playing the greatest hits over and over. Innovation only comes when creators start to look beyond.